The saloon went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before trouble, and Ruth Calloway felt every eye in the place swing toward her the moment Emmett Voss stepped out from behind the bar with a folded paper in his hand. "Well now," Voss said, loud enough to carry to the back tables, "if it isn't the widow Calloway come to settle up at last. I've come to tell you plainly, in front of whoever cares to listen, that my husband never signed any marker with you, Mr. Voss." Ruth kept her chin level and her voice steady, though her hands, folded tight at her waist, betrayed her. "Daniel didn't gamble. He hadn't the money to gamble, and he hadn't the taste for it either, and I'll not stand here and let you say otherwise to make yourself $40 richer off a dead man's name. That paper says different." Voss set it on the nearest table and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, as if the gesture alone settled the matter. "Daniel Calloway's own signature, dated the week before he passed. $40 owed, plus what interest has accrued since, and I've been more than patient, Mrs. Calloway, on account of your grief. But patience runs out, and the bank's asking after my own accounts, and I mean to have what's owed me, one way or another. That little laundry lot of yours would cover it handsomely." A ripple of murmuring moved through the saloon, the particular hungry murmur of a town settling in to watch someone else's ruin. 2 of Voss's men, a thick-necked fellow called Curly and a rangy one named Bart, had drifted up on either side of Ruth without her quite noticing when they'd moved, the way wolves drift toward a thing already looking cornered. "I haven't got $40, Ruth said, and hated how thin her voice had gone. "I haven't got 4. Everything I earn from the wash goes to feed my boy and pay what little rent I owe honest folks in this town. If you take the lot, we've nowhere left to go." "Then perhaps you ought to have married a man who didn't leave debts behind him," Voss said, and the cruelty of it landed clean and casual, the way only a man certain of his own power could afford to be cruel. It was then that a chair scraped back at the far corner table, slow and deliberate, and a man who had sat there 3 days running, nursing black coffee and saying next to nothing to anyone, rose to his full height and crossed the room without hurrying at all. Ruth had noticed him before, the way anyone notices a stranger who says little and watches everything. A lean, weathered man in a trail coat gone gray with dust, a gun belt worn plain and unshowy, eyes the color of creek water in winter. She had not expected him to move at all, let alone toward her. "That's a forgery," the drifter said. 2 words at first, then, when the room didn't quite understand, he meant to keep talking more. "I've seen enough paper in my time to know a hand that's been guided by another man's, and that signature's got a hitch in the D that no man writes natural. Somebody traced that Voss, and I'd wager it wasn't Daniel Calloway holding the pen at the end of it." Voss's face went tight. "And who in the hell are you to say so?" "Name's Sawyer Quinn." He said it plain, without weight, though something in the way the room stilled around the name suggested at least a few men present had heard it somewhere before and were busy remembering where. "I don't much care who you are, Voss, or how many men you've got standing close enough to make a woman feel cornered in a public room. I care that you're fixing to take a widow's last piece of ground off a paper that doesn't hold up to a plain look. So I'll ask you, friendly as I know how, to put it away and leave the lady be." "This isn't your business, drifter." Curly took a half step forward, the practiced menace of a man used to being the biggest trouble in any given room. "I've made it my business," Sawyer said, "the moment I watched 2 grown men crowd a woman half their size in front of a room full of people too comfortable to say a word about it. That's enough. Sit back down, or don't, but either way the lady's not signing anything today." For a long moment nobody moved. Then Voss, reading something in the drifter's stillness that Curly and Bart hadn't yet learned to read, waved his men back with a small, irritated gesture. "This isn't finished, Mrs. Calloway. I'll have Judge Renner look at that paper himself, and we'll see whose word carries more weight in this county, a grieving widow's or a signed marker with witnesses to it." "Witnesses," Sawyer said. "Now that's an interesting word. Who witnessed Daniel Calloway sign it?" Voss's jaw worked. "That's a matter for the judge." "It's a matter for anybody with eyes," Sawyer said. "Seeing as you just told this whole room a signature was witnessed, and now you can't seem to recall by whom. I expect we'll all be curious to hear that answer when the judge asks it proper." Daniel had been dead 8 months. Thrown from a Greenbroke horse, he'd had no business trying to gentle himself. Too proud to pay a man who knew the work better. And Ruth had spent every one of those 8 months learning exactly how quickly a town's sympathy thinned once the funeral flowers wilted. She had taken in wash to keep herself and Charlie fed, scrubbing other people's linens raw-handed from dawn past dark, and had told herself she was managing well enough. Right up until Emmett Voss decided a dead man's supposed debts made a tidier profit than honest interest ever could. He walked Ruth out of the saloon himself, one hand light and careful at her elbow, not touching more than courtesy allowed, and it was only once they'd reached the boardwalk and the cold night air that she realized she was shaking. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stood up." "You'd have found your own way through it," Sawyer said. "Most folks do, given time. I just happened to be sitting close enough to save you some of the weight." He touched his hat brim, brief and formal, and made to walk on toward the livery, and Ruth found herself, oddly, reluctant to let him go so easily. "You've been in that corner 3 days," she said. "Watching. I don't suppose you tell me what for." Something shuddered behind his eyes, quick and practiced. "Just passing through, ma'am. Man gets tired of writing sometimes and likes to sit a spell before he moves on." She did not believe that was the whole truth, but she let it be, because a woman with a debt collector circling her doorstep hadn't the luxury of chasing after a stranger's secrets. He did not move on the next morning, nor the one after that. He took a room above the livery and a bit of work mending fence for old Holly's Pratt, and he made a habit, Ruth noticed, of walking past her small laundry lot at dusk on his way back from the livery, never stopping long, never saying much, but somehow always near enough that the 2 toughs Voss had set loafing across the street eventually stopped loafing there at all. Not everyone in Flint Hollow welcomed the change. Sheriff Dale Rutten, who owed Voss more favors than a lawman ought to admit to owing anyone, took to warning folks off the drifter with the particular oily concern of a man protecting his own interests rather than the town's. "Man won't say 2 words about where he's from or where he's headed," Rutten told anyone who'd listen at the mercantile counter. "That kind of quiet usually means a man's got something behind him he'd rather nobody asked after. I'd not go trusting my laundry lot to a stranger like that, was I the widow Calloway." "Seems to me," old Holly's Pratt said, not looking up from the harness he was mending, "a man's quiet don't tell near as much about him as what he does with his hands while he's being quiet. Quinn's mended every loose board on my place without being asked twice, and hasn't once raised his voice nor his fists to anybody who didn't raise trouble first. I'll take that over a badge that looks the other way whenever Emmett Voss comes calling." Rutten had no ready answer for that, and made himself scarce at the mercantile counter for a spell after, though he did not stop watching Sawyer with a wary, resentful eye whenever their paths crossed in the street. It was her boy, Charlie, 7 years old and entirely without his mother's caution, who finally got the man talking. "Are you a gunfighter?" Charlie asked him bluntly, one evening, watching Sawyer mend a hinge on the laundry door Voss's men had loosened out of spite. Curly said you used to wear a badge someplace and shot 3 men dead, and that's why you don't talk. Charlie, Ruth said, mortified. But Sawyer only kept working the hinge, unhurried. I wore a badge once, he said after a while, in a town smaller than this one a long time back. There was trouble I couldn't stop in time, and a man I was sworn to protect died on account of my being too slow to see it coming. I took the badge off after that and never put another one on, and I found it easier most days to say less than more, on account of most of what I've got to say isn't much comfort to anybody. He set the hinge and tested the door, swinging smooth now. That's the whole of it, and I'd as soon you not go repeating the gunfighter part around town. Man gets a reputation like that, folks start expecting him to live up to it. I think you're brave, Charlie said, simply. The way only a child can deliver the plainest truth without knowing its weight, and something in Sawyer Quinn's careful, guarded face loosened just slightly at that, though he said nothing more about it. On a Sunday some weeks into that quiet arrangement, Ruth found herself setting a third plate at her own table without quite deciding to. And when Sawyer knocked at the appointed hour with a jar of wild plum preserves he'd traded Holly's Pratt's wife for, she found she was glad of the excuse. You needn't have brought anything, she said, though she took the jar gladly enough. Man doesn't come to supper empty-handed, if his mother raised him right, Sawyer said, and there was something almost boyish in the small, careful smile that went with it, a thing Ruth hadn't yet seen cross his guarded face. Charlie peppered him through the whole meal with questions about trail towns and river crossings, and whether he'd ever seen a real buffalo herd, and Sawyer answered each one with more patience and more words than Ruth had heard him spend on anyone since he'd arrived, until she began to understand that his silence wasn't emptiness at all, only carefulness. A man rationing himself against a world that had once cost him dearly for speaking too late. You're easier with him than with grown folks, she observed, once Charlie had been sent to wash for bed. Grown folks generally want something from a conversation, Sawyer said. A boy just wants the story. It's restful, talking to somebody who isn't measuring your words against some use they mean to make of them. I'm not measuring, Ruth said, quiet. He looked at her a long moment across the lamplight. No, he said finally. I don't believe you are. That's a rarer thing than you'd know, Mrs. Calloway, and I find I like the rest of it considerably. Voss did not wait long to press his advantage elsewhere. 2 nights later, someone put a torch to the drying line behind Ruth's laundry, scorching a week's worth of finished wash and half the fence besides, and left no doubt as to the message intended. Ruth stood in the smoking wreck of her yard at dawn with her hands pressed to her mouth, doing the arithmetic of ruin, the wash she now owed her customers, the money she didn't have to replace it, the debt Voss meant to make cert she couldn't outrun no matter which way she turned. Sawyer arrived before she'd finished counting the damage, drawn by the smoke, and stood beside her a long moment surveying the ruin with a stillness that Ruth had come to understand meant he was thinking hard rather than feeling nothing. By mid-morning, half the women in Flint Hollow who'd washed their linens through Ruth's hands, these 8 months had arrived with their own kettles and lye soap and spare clothesline, refusing to let Voss's cruelty stand as the last word on the matter. And Holly's Pratt sent over enough milled lumber to rebuild the fence twice over without being asked. It was, Ruth thought, watching the yard fill with neighbors instead of ash, the first time since Daniel's death that the town's sympathy had felt like something solid enough to lean on rather than words offered once, and then withdrawn. This ends now, Sawyer said, once the worst of the wreck had been cleared and the women had gone back to their own kitchens. I've let Voss circle you 2 weeks hoping the judge would settle it clean and quiet. He's shown me he doesn't mean to let it stay quiet, so I'll not either. What are you going to do? Find whoever actually held the pen on that marker, Sawyer said. A forger that careless leaves a trail if a man knows where to look, and I spent enough years reading trails for a living to still remember how. It took him 2 days of quiet asking. The bank clerk, a nervous young man named Fenn who plainly feared Voss more than he trusted his own conscience, would say only that he'd noted certain irregularities in Voss's filings before and thought better of mentioning them aloud. It was Della, a saloon girl who poured drinks and kept her own counsel about a great deal more than she ever let on, who gave Sawyer the thread worth pulling. Voss don't write his own markers, she told him quietly, refilling his coffee in the corner where he still sat most evenings out of habit as much as watchfulness. Never has, not since I've poured for him. Gets a hired hand to do the fine penmanship, on account of his own hand shakes something fierce from the drink. Man he used to use was called Purdy. Left the county sudden, back in the fall, right around the time your widow's husband passed. You wouldn't happen to know where Purdy went. Cheyenne, last I heard, working a livery there. But I'd wager the county recorder's office has his hand on file someplace, if you know to go looking for it. Man like Purdy always leaves a bill of sale or two lying around with his name plain on it. Sawyer rode to the county seat himself and spent a full day going through filed papers with the recorder's grudging permission, and found what he needed by supper time. A bill of sale for a wagon, filed the same month as the marker, signed by Purdy himself in a hand that matched the forged D on Daniel Calloway's marker exactly, down to the same telltale hitch that no honest man's hand repeated by accident. Sheriff Rutten tried once to stop the matter from ever reaching the judge at all, catching Sawyer alone outside the livery the evening he returned from the county seat. Man ought to think careful before he goes stirring up trouble for Emmett Voss in this county, Rutten said, thumbs hooked in his belt in poor imitation of a confidence he didn't quite own. Voss has friends. Man in your position, no roots here, no history anybody can vouch for. Folks might start wondering whose side you're really working for, bringing accusations against an established businessman. Folks are welcome to wonder whatever they like, Sawyer said, not breaking stride. I've got a bill of sale in my saddlebag with a forger's own hand on it, plain as daylight, and I mean to lay it in front of Judge Renner whether you'd rather I didn't. If you've got friends whose comfort matters more to you than a widow's roof, Sheriff, that's a burden you'll carry, not me. Rutten had no answer worth the breath it would cost him, and stepped aside. He laid it all before Judge Renner himself, in the same saloon that had nearly cornered Ruth into ruin 2 weeks before. The whole town crowded in to watch a reckoning they'd only half believed would come. Mr. Purdy's hand is a plain match to the marker, Sawyer said, setting both documents side by side on the bar for the judge and anyone else to see. Mrs. Calloway's testified from the first that her husband never signed such a paper and never gambled a day she knew him. I'd ask the judge to consider which is more likely, that a careful man forged one document and got sloppy on the second, or that a grieving widow's memory of her own marriage is somehow less reliable than a debt collector's marker. Judge Renner studied both signatures a long, silent minute, the whole saloon holding its breath around him, and then looked up at Voss with an expression that had already decided the matter before he spoke a word of it aloud. Mr. Voss, I'll want Purdy's whereabouts, and I'll want them by week's end, because I intend to ask him myself whose hand guided his pen on that marker. Until such time as this is settled to my satisfaction, Mrs. Calloway owes you nothing, and I'd strongly advise your men stay well clear of her property, or I'll be inclined to look considerably harder at every marker you've ever filed in this county. Voss said nothing at all, which told the room everything it needed to know, and within the week he had quietly left Flint Hollow altogether, rather than answer for a fraud that had finally caught up with him. His two hired men drifting off after him, with considerably less swagger than they'd arrived with. Sheriff Rutten, sensing which way the whole county's opinion had now turned, resigned his post before the summer was out and was not much missed. Ruth found Sawyer that evening sitting again in his corner table, the coffee gone cold in front of him, and she crossed the room without letting herself think too hard about it first. "You could have ridden on the moment Voss backed down," she said, sitting across from him. "Most men would have. You done what you came to do." "I hadn't planned on staying this long anywhere," Sawyer admitted. "Been drifting 6 years now, since I put the badge down. Didn't figure a town would ever feel like a place worth stopping in again." He turned his cup slow in its saucer, the old habit of a careful man choosing words with the same weight he chose everything else. "Your boy asked me once if I was brave. Truth is, I've spent 6 years being nothing braver than tired, moving on before anything could ask more of me than watching from a corner. Standing up in that saloon for you was the first thing I've done in a long while that felt like courage instead of habit." "Then perhaps," Ruth said, "you found a town worth being brave in a while longer." He looked at her then, really looked, the guarded stillness in his face giving way, slow and careful, to something warmer. "I believe I have, Mrs. Calloway. If you'll have a silent drifter with more scars than conversation hanging around your laundry lot a while longer, I find I'm in no particular hurry to ride on." "Charlie would tell you plainly that you talk plenty, once a person gives you reason to," Ruth said, smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. "And I find, Mr. Quinn, that I'm not in any hurry to see you go, either. There's a thing I ought to tell you first, before you go deciding too kindly of me," he said, turning the coffee cup once more. "The town I wore that badge in, I've never once said its name aloud since I left it, not to anybody. I will, if you'd care to hear it. I find I'd rather you know the whole of a man before you go trusting him with a boy who thinks the world of him already." "I'd like to hear it," Ruth said, "whenever you're ready to tell it. And I'd like you to know, whatever it is, it won't change what I've already seen plain with my own eyes these 2 weeks. A man who stood up in a room nobody else would stand up in, and kept standing after, quiet as that standing was. Daniel was a good man in his way, but he never once stood up for anybody but himself when trouble came calling. I've had my fill of quiet that meant nothing behind it. I don't believe yours is that kind." He told her, that evening and over several evenings after, the whole of it in careful pieces. A town called Larkin's Ford. A shootout he'd arrived at moments too late to prevent. A young deputy under his charge who hadn't lived to see the following morning. It was not a story that excused itself or asked for pity, only one that explained, at last, why a capable man had spent 6 years choosing corners over conversation. And Ruth found that hearing it, rather than diminishing him, only deepened the quiet respect she'd already begun to hold for him. He stayed through that winter mending fence and hinges and whatever else wanted mending. And by spring, he'd stopped taking the room above the livery at all, having built, with his own 2 hands and Charlie underfoot most afternoons offering advice no one had asked for, a small addition onto the back of the laundry that Ruth never did get around to calling anything but home. Holly's Pratt offered him steady work through the cold months, and more than a few of the same women who'd carried kettles into Ruth's yard the morning after the fire found themselves, come Christmas, bringing pies to the laundry instead, on no better excuse than wanting to see for themselves whether the rumors of a courtship were true. They were married in May, in the same street where a debt collector had once tried to corner a widow into ruin, with half of Flint Hollow turned out to see a silent man say his vows in a voice steady enough to carry to the back row. Charlie stood beside them solemn as any grown groomsman, wearing a borrowed collar 2 sizes too large and grinning through the whole ceremony regardless. And Della, who'd poured the coffee that started the unraveling of Voss's fraud, brought a bouquet of prairie asters she'd gathered herself and cried harder than anyone save Holly's Pratt's own wife. Ruth thought, watching Sawyer say his vows, that some men needed very few words at all to say the truest things a heart could hold. She had simply needed to be standing close enough, that one evening in the saloon, to hear the two that mattered most. "Enough," he had said, rising from his chair. It had taken her the whole winter to understand it had meant, from that very first moment, enough loneliness for them both. Charlie grew up telling the story of that night in the saloon to anyone patient enough to sit still long enough to hear it through, embellishing it a little more with each passing year, adding a gunfight here and a chase there that had never once actually happened, until the quiet drifter who'd once risen slowly from his corner table became, in the boy's eager telling, something closer to legend than to the plain, careful, patient man Ruth had truly come to love. She never corrected him overmuch. She understood, better than most, that the truest courage rarely announced itself with noise, and that a single word spoken at the right moment, by a man who'd learned the hard cost of speaking too late, could carry a whole lifetime of meaning behind it. Flint Hollow, in time, stopped being merely a rough saloon town men passed through on their way to somewhere better, and became, for the three of them, simply and finally, home. The one place Sawyer Quinn had ever found worth staying in, and the one debt, he liked to say, he was glad to go on paying every single day for the rest of his life, gladly, and without a single word of complaint, though he never did stop being a man of few of them.